The lesson of genius. The hybrid tank lay in silence under a thin blanket of snow, its twisted treads and scorched engine a testament to ambition, ingenuity, and failure. Keller walked among the wreckage, the cold biting through his coat, but the chill in his heart was far deeper. For weeks, they had chased the impossible to capture the brilliance of the Sherman, without understanding the mind and system that created it. High Command demanded a final report. Keller knew this would determine not just his career, but the fate of the engineers and perhaps the reputation of German armored warfare. Yet he felt a strange sense of peace. They had failed in one sense, but in another, they had uncovered a truth that brute force alone could never teach. In the briefing room, Keller laid out the facts. The hybrid prototype had unmatched speed, unprecedented maneuverability, but critical systemic weaknesses. Any attempt to deploy it in combat could result in catastrophic failure, endangering both machine and crew. He emphasized that the strength of the Sherman was not just in its mechanics, but in the integration of design, supply, and human operation. A synergy the Germans had overlooked. The generals listened in stunned silence. Some were furious, some confused, but Keller pressed on. We cannot copy brilliance. We can only study it, learn from it, and adapt what is possible. Our obsession with imitation has blinded us to innovation. One general sneered. So we waste months on a machine that cannot fight? Keller met his gaze steadily. Not wasted. Lessons learned, knowledge gained. We now understand what cannot be forced, and that understanding is more valuable than a failed tank. Outside, the world seemed indifferent. The war raged on, soldiers marched, and artillery fire echoed in distant forests. Yet inside the factory, a quieter battle had been fought between hubris and humility, imitation and insight, raw power and subtle intelligence. In the following weeks, Keller and his team applied the lessons in small but significant ways. Tiger tanks were modified to include improved suspension inspired by the Sherman. Crews were trained to think adaptively rather than rigidly following protocol. Supply chains were reorganized to improve efficiency and endurance. Slowly, the impossible knowledge the hybrid had revealed was translated into practical advantage. But the most profound change was in Keller himself. He had learned that engineering was not merely about building machines. It was about understanding them, understanding the humans who operate them, and understanding the systems they inhabit. He began writing detailed notes, not just for tanks, but for future generations of engineers. A testament to the idea that true brilliance cannot be forced, it must be studied, respected, and integrated. Months later, as Keller walked through the snowy remnants of the testing grounds, he paused at the skeletal frame of the hybrid prototype. He traced his fingers along the scorched metal, feeling a strange kinship with the machine. It had been more than a tank, it had been a teacher. Its failure had revealed a truth no victory ever could. The genius of creation is more than the sum of its parts, and the greatest victories often begin with understanding one's own limitations. Then came the final, unexpected twist. A captured American officer, later brought for questioning, had observed the German engineers at work. He noted Keller's meticulous adjustments, the careful integration of systems, and the hybrid tank's moments of brilliance. Weeks later, when he returned to Allied command, he remarked quietly, "They are not building what we fear, they are learning what we admire. That is far more dangerous." The words echoed in Keller's mind. Danger, admiration, respect, the subtle dance of war, intelligence, and human creativity. He realized that the hybrid tank, though destroyed, had already changed the course of engineering philosophy. It had forced his side to confront the limits of imitation, to value ingenuity over brute force, and to acknowledge the quiet genius of the enemy. Years later, Keller would tell the story to young engineers, long after the war had ended. In a quiet classroom far from snow or gunfire, he would describe the hybrid, the failures, the lessons, and he would end the story with the same thought that had haunted him through those bitter months. Brilliance cannot be copied. It can only be understood, and the greatest victories come not from dominating machines, but from understanding the minds that create them. The factory lay abandoned, the hybrid's metal slowly rusting in the snow, yet its legacy endured, in notes, in designs, and in the minds of those who had witnessed its rise and fall. In the end, the tank had been a failure in battle but a triumph in revelation, a monument to the idea that intelligence, subtlety, and understanding often outweigh brute force. And somewhere in the distance, across the frozen forests and shattered towns of Europe, the war continued. Machines clashed, soldiers fought, and history was written in fire and steel. Yet the lesson of the hybrid tank, the lesson Keller had learned in the bitter cold of Bavaria, would endure far longer than any battlefield victory. The mind that creates cannot be copied, and the true genius of war lies not in a weapon, but in the wisdom of those who wield it. Trial by fire spring arrived late that year, stubbornly clinging to the snow-streaked forests around the Bavarian testing grounds. Yet even as the cold receded, the tension inside the factory only grew. Keller had barely slept in weeks, his nights haunted by the memory of the hybrid prototype's uncontrolled acceleration, his days consumed by frantic calculations and modifications. Every test, every tweak, brought them closer to understanding the Sherman's hidden genius, and yet, the more they learned, the more elusive the solution became. High Command demanded progress. A new order had arrived. The hybrid tank must now be tested under simulated battlefield conditions, alongside infantry units and artillery fire. It was no longer just a test of engineering skill, it was a test of survival. Keller's heart pounded as the prototype rumbled forward into the clearing. Soldiers crouched behind snow-dusted barricades, rifles ready, while artillery crews fired at pre-marked targets to simulate combat. Every move of the hybrid tank was scrutinized. Every shudder, every squeal of the treads could spell the difference between victory and catastrophe. At first, the machine performed beautifully. It darted between obstacles, climbed embankments, and absorbed simulated artillery blasts with surprising resilience. Keller allowed himself a brief smile. Perhaps the lessons of the Sherman could be applied after all. But then came the first real shock. A simulated minefield had been laid across the course carefully, but unpredictably. The hybrid tank, despite its agility, triggered a hidden explosive. The blast rocked the machine violently, sending it skidding across the icy ground. Sparks and smoke erupted from its exposed joints, and the crew inside screamed in panic. Keller's stomach twisted. He had anticipated many weaknesses, but never the interplay of human error and mechanical precision under unpredictable battlefield conditions. The tank's survival depended not only on its design, but on the crew's instincts, something no engineer could fully account for. "Pull it back," Richter shouted, running toward the prototype as technicians scrambled to secure it. Keller climbed into the observation tower, eyes wide, heart racing. He realized the terrifying truth. The hybrid was brilliant, yes, but its brilliance was fragile, dependent on perfect execution and careful handling. On the chaotic battlefield, those conditions could never be guaranteed. The next days were worse. Each test exposed new vulnerabilities: a structural weld that bent under repeated fire, a track mechanism that jammed in mud, a cooling system that overheated under sustained use. Keller worked tirelessly, re-engineering, adjusting, recalibrating, but with every improvement, another flaw appeared. Yet amidst the stress and exhaustion, moments of humanity emerged. Keller noticed the soldiers assigned to operate the tank. They were young, often terrified, yet brimming with determination. One crewman, Dieter, barely 19, had a way of anticipating the tank's movements, steering it with an almost instinctual precision that no blueprint could teach. Keller realized then that machines were only as good as the people who operated them, a lesson that resonated far beyond engineering. One evening, after a particularly grueling test, Keller walked alone among the wrecked prototypes and scattered debris. The moonlight reflected off twisted metal like cold fire. He thought of the Sherman, its subtle genius, the engineers and crews who had made it excel. He thought of his own work, brilliant in theory but flawed in practice, and he realized something that chilled him more than any battlefield. Imitation could only go so far. Then came the final test of full-scale simulation with artillery, infantry, and live-fire obstacles. High Command insisted that the hybrid prove itself under conditions as close to real war as possible. The engineers gathered, tense, the air thick with anticipation and fear. The hybrid moved forward, weaving through simulated enemy positions. With surprising grace, it avoided artillery blasts, navigated rubble, and demonstrated a level of agility no Tiger tank had ever achieved. Keller allowed himself a flicker of hope. Perhaps this time, the machine would succeed. But then, the shocking flaw revealed itself. A concentrated barrage targeted the engine compartment, the very heart of the Sherman-inspired system. The cooling lever, the balancing system, the entire hybrid mechanism designed to mimic American ingenuity failed catastrophically. Flames erupted from the rear, the treads buckled, and the tank lurched violently. The crew scrambled to escape, narrowly avoiding being trapped inside. Keller's stomach dropped. He had predicted vulnerabilities, but not a total systemic failure under sustained pressure. The tank had proven the Sherman's design principle: speed, balance, and endurance must coexist perfectly. Any attempt to force one aspect without understanding the underlying system would lead to disaster. Richter approached, face pale. Keller, it's worse than we thought. It cannot survive real combat. Keller nodded slowly, the weight of realization pressing down. The hybrid was a marvel of engineering. Yes, but it was also a warning. Brute force, brute imitation, and hubris could never replicate the subtleties of a machine born from an ecosystem of thought, design, and human intuition. As the engineers examined the wreckage the next day, Keller made a decision. They would not try to perfect the hybrid. Instead, they would study it, learn from it, and apply the lessons to improve their own designs in smaller, incremental ways. Trying to copy the Sherman had revealed something far more important than creating a superior tank. It had revealed the limitations of imitation and the value of understanding true genius. That night, Keller returned to the factory, standing alone among scattered blueprints and twisted metal. Snow fell softly outside, muting the world in quiet white. He looked at the hybrid prototype, scarred and smoking, and realized it would never see combat. Yet in its failure lay the most profound lesson of all. Some brilliance cannot be replicated. It must be understood, respected, and adapted, not copied. And in that silent, frozen factory, Keller made a vow to honor intelligence over force, subtlety over raw power, and innovation over imitation. The war was far from over, but perhaps the real victory was not in building a better tank but in learning how to think better. The prototype in Motionte next morning. The factory floor buzzed with an urgency that felt almost alive. Keller arrived first, rubbing the frost from his hands, his breath rising in small clouds as he approached the hybrid prototype. The snow outside reflected pale light through the massive windows, but inside, the hum of machinery and the smell of hot metal made the world feel dangerous and electric. "Time to test it again," Richter said, voice clipped, as he approached. The tank, his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed only a fraction of his unease. "This time, we push it further. We need to see what it can really do." Keller nodded. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. The night before, the idea had come to him: the air balancing lever from the Sherman, which could stabilize engine heat and prevent catastrophic failure. He had modified the prototype overnight, threading wires, adjusting valves, and integrating a system that mimicked the subtle genius of the American design. It was risky. One wrong adjustment, one miscalculation, and the tank could explode under its own power. The test track stretched over the frozen hills behind the factory, a brutal terrain designed to challenge every machine. Heavy snow made the ground uneven, ice threatening to swallow anything that moved too slowly. As the prototype rumbled forward for the first time, Keller's stomach twisted. Every engine roar, every shudder of the treads, felt amplified in his chest. At first, nothing extraordinary happened. The tank moved, struggled a bit over icy patches, then suddenly glided over a frozen ditch as if the ground itself were respecting its weight. The engineers watching from the sidelines gasped. It wasn't just surviving the terrain, it was dancing over it. Richter stepped closer, squinting. "By the fatherland, it's working." But the triumph was short-lived. Midway through the second lap, the tank's engine started to sputter violently. Sparks erupted from the rear, smoke curling into the freezing air. Keller's heart sank. Had he miscalculated again? "No. Wait," he shouted. He scrambled to a control panel on the side of the tank. Adjusting the air balance lever, he felt the engine stabilize, the smoke dissipate, and the roar soften into a smooth, powerful hum. Richter's jaw tightened. Ingenious, but barely under control. Keller's mind raced. This was more than a machine. It was an idea, a test of human ingenuity against the brute force of conventional thinking. Yet the victory was fragile. One flaw, one overlooked detail, and everything could be lost. The following weeks turned into a blur of experimentation. The engineers pushed the prototype over snow, mud, and rubble, testing it in conditions that mirrored the front lines. Every day brought a new lesson, a new tweak. Keller grew obsessed, sometimes working for 20 hours without rest, documenting every failure and small triumph. Then came the first battlefield simulation. The Germans had arranged a mock engagement with Sherman tanks captured from North Africa. Keller watched from the observation tower, heart hammering, as the hybrid tank moved across the field. At first, it outmaneuvered every Sherman, proving speed and agility could be engineered, even on the hulking Tiger chassis. But then, the unthinkable happened. One of the Shermans fired a round directly at the tank's flank. The shot struck an area Keller had overlooked, the welded joint near the engine compartment. A shudder ran through the hybrid machine, metal buckling slightly under the impact. Keller's stomach sank. The armor, it isn't Tiger strong at every angle. Richter's eyes narrowed. So the flaw isn't just mechanical, it's structural. Keller realized the terrifying truth. No matter how much they replicated the Sherman's mechanics, the hybrid could never match the Tiger's raw defensive strength. They had created a machine that was faster, more flexible, more ingenious, but also more vulnerable in unexpected ways. Tension in the factory surged. High command demanded a report, and Keller knew there was no way to sugarcoat the findings. He presented the prototype, detailing its strengths and its shocking vulnerability. He explained the balance between speed, endurance, and armor, the interplay of engineering genius that the Americans had mastered. The room was silent when he finished. Then Richter spoke. So we have a machine that can outmaneuver the enemy, but can also be destroyed in a single critical hit. Yes, Keller admitted, voice low. It's brilliant, but fragile. We cannot replicate the Sherman perfectly, and if we tried to force it, it will fail catastrophically. The high command was furious. They demanded a Tiger-class solution, one that could survive any battlefield. But Keller's prototype, while impressive, could never meet that standard. It was then that the engineers received unexpected news. American forces were moving into Italy, pushing through the Apennine Mountains with speed that no one in Germany had anticipated. The spark of innovation. The winter of 1943 in Germany was harsh, unforgiving, and silent, except for the hum of factories deep in the industrial heart of Bavaria. Smokestacks clawed at the gray sky as if challenging the heavens themselves. Inside one of these sprawling factories, a team of engineers huddled over blueprints that would determine the fate of armored warfare. The Germans had captured several American tanks from the North African campaign, and whispers of their unmatched speed and agility had reached even the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht. What makes them so fast? Asked Friedrich Keller, the youngest engineer in the team, a boy barely 25, but with the instincts of a seasoned designer. His voice trembled not from fear, but from awe. He traced his fingers along the faded diagrams of the Sherman tank, noting every curve, every bolt, every mechanism. Speed alone won't win a war, muttered Hauptmann Richter, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the map of countless battles. But if we can understand it, if we can copy it, then maybe we can finally turn the tide. On the Eastern Front, the room was filled with tension, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the unspoken knowledge that failure here would be fatal. The German High Command demanded results, and the engineers had been given less than 6 months to reverse engineer what was supposed to be impossible. Keller studied the Sherman's engine with a strange sense of reverence. Unlike the monstrous, roaring Tiger tanks of German-designed tanks that consumed fuel like hungry beasts, the Sherman's engine was elegant, almost deceptively simple. He noticed the placement of the transmission, the way the suspension absorbed shocks, the careful balance of weight. But what struck him most was a subtle hum he heard when the captured tanks were started. It wasn't loud, but it resonated through the metal skeleton, a rhythm that spoke of precision, harmony, and something almost a human. Everyone thinks the Tiger is the pinnacle, Keller said quietly to himself. But Richter heard him. Exactly. Everyone thinks brute force is enough, Richter replied. But you're thinking differently. That is dangerous, and brilliant, dangerous. Because questioning the supremacy of the Tiger could be seen as treason. Brilliant, because this spark of curiosity might just save German tanks from repeated failure on the battlefield. The engineers worked day and night. The factory floor became a battlefield of its own, clanging metal, steaming oil, and the low, constant buzz of welding machines creating a symphony of war. Keller became obsessed. He spent hours crawling beneath the Sherman, tracing every wire, examining every gear. He discovered a subtle system in the tracks, a series of interconnected shock absorbers that allowed the tank to maintain its speed over rough terrain without shaking apart. This was something the Tiger could not do. Its armor was nearly invincible, yes, but it struggled over soft ground, mud, and rubble. The Sherman moved with a grace that the Germans had dismissed as amateurish, but Keller saw it for what it was, a machine designed to endure, adapt, and survive. By February, a prototype was underway. The engineers had built a Tiger shell around the new design, but the engine and suspension were copied almost exactly from the Sherman. Keller watched as the first test vehicle rumbled down the testing track, its metal body shaking, sputtering, yet somehow moving with a fluidity that was shocking to every German engineer present. But then came the first twist. During a high-speed maneuver, the prototype's engine began to smoke. Sparks flew from the transmission, and the vehicle lurched violently, almost tipping over. The test crew scrambled for safety as the tank came to a halt, shuddering. Keller's stomach dropped. Every engineer in the room froze, knowing that months of work could be ruined in seconds. Richter stepped forward, his eyes cold but calculating. "What did we miss?" he demanded. Keller hesitated, then spoke softly, almost ashamed. "It's not just the engine or the suspension. It's the way the Americans designed the cooling system. They allowed for something we didn't account for, the balance, the airflow. It's built for long-distance endurance, not just brute power. If we push it too hard, it will fail." A stunned silence filled the room. For weeks, the team had assumed the Sherman's advantage was its armor, or rather, the lack of it made it irrelevant in comparison to the Tiger. No one had considered that its true strength lay in the delicate balance of its mechanics, a flaw the Germans had not yet understood. "And we cannot replicate that?" Richter asked, his voice lower, almost fearful. Keller shook his head. "Not perfectly. We can approximate it. But the Americans engineered it for a very specific purpose. Their soldiers, their supply lines, it's all part of the design. We cannot just copy a machine without understanding the ecosystem that created it." The weight of the revelation settled over the factory like a heavy fog. The Germans could never truly replicate the Sherman. They could try, modify, brute force it, but the Sherman's genius was subtle, hidden in places where metal alone could not reach. Keller felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. Dread, because failure meant punishment, and exhilaration, because he had glimpsed the brilliance of a design that his own side could not understand. For the first time, he felt admiration for the enemy, not for their ideology, not for their weapons, but for the thoughtfulness, the intelligence that went into their creation. Night fell over the factory, and the engineers returned to their bunks, exhausted, haunted by the day's failure yet invigorated by the challenge. Keller stayed behind, crawling under the prototype, studying the engine again. He traced the air vents, the pistons, the connections, trying to find a solution, a way to make the German design work without betraying its Tiger heritage. Suddenly, a memory struck him, an observation from the captured Sherman manuals, almost dismissed as trivial at the time. A small lever near the driver's seat, a system for balancing engine heat across long distances. It seemed simple, almost laughable, but it might just be the key. Keller's pulse raced. If he could adapt this system, integrate it without compromising